Dave King. I'm very moved by the honor of introducing Dave King. This could be done by any number of people whom I'm going to refer to in a minute. So I hope I make it through this in one piece. Shirley King, who's a Hall of Famer in everyone's book, and anyone who worked with Dave knows that Shirley is key, to say the least, especially in challenging times, right, Cheryl? And Shirley is here. She did everything at camp. David Jr. is here, Dave and Shirley's son. Kathy, and two of their grandchildren. Here's Kathy there, and two of their grandchildren, Dylan and Megan. But in addition, there's a whole other family here. Most of them happen to be at the tables on this side, but there's some others around. If you were either a camper or a staff member or worked with Dave King, would you just stand up very briefly so we can see all of you? These people came from Seattle. They drove from Ohio, from Virginia, and from Grahamsville, I think, Paul Brown. And I think Peggy came from Long Island, which is probably the hardest drive of all. You guys can sit down. These are the people Dave calls his kids. And I was one of them too. I was already standing, but I need to stand. For many of us in the 1960s, growing up in the 60s and early 70s, Frost Valley was the most consistent thing in our lives, by far. Whatever happened during what we called the year, because we waited to come to camp, whatever craziness or chaos or disruption or discontinuity in our communities, sometimes in our families, between the generations in our families, during the 60s, whatever happened, we knew that when we walked into this place, there would be a man standing there, tall. He couldn't help that part, but it certainly added to the whole shtick. And he had a way of looking down at you, which was, in my case, quite inevitable. But also at you. I don't know how he did it. It's a trick. He'd look down, his arms were crossed, and he would greet you at what was essentially the gates of a paradise, a special world where strife, theological, racial, ethnic, economic, generational, disappeared. And he was in charge of saying all that. He treated everyone like an individual. He knew us. He knew our backgrounds. He knew our names. But he also treated everyone equally. And like the stare from above and direct at you, it's also a trick to be able to look at someone and to treat someone as an individual. I was Al. He knew me. He knew my parents. He knew my background. He knew my crises. He also treated me with equality. I had a Frost Valley friend, somebody I grew up with, who one summer had spent the year suffering from a family torn apart by a particularly nasty divorce. But there was Dave, open-armed at the gates, and somehow he knew that this kid needed a little extra love. And he reached way down to this kid, and he hugged him for the longest time. And for a couple weeks, the divorce disappeared because he was part of our family. I had a dear friend, many of our colleagues will know who she is, but I won't name her, who one way or other lost both parents and had to deal with not a great sibling. And she declared herself legally independent before she reached the age of 18 and was, and in her heart anyway, still a Frost Valley lifer. And Dave and Shirley took her in. They knew her, they loved her. They were her parents. A friend of mine named Steve, who grew up with me here, was bullied all year for what I think today we all agree was a kind of minor case of obesity, but just a little bit bigger than everybody else, and you got bullied. I like to think it doesn't happen as much anymore, but Dave had a way of making that bullied kid a star, and after his 6 weeks here, 3 sessions, he was a star, and he felt confident, and he felt good. So he calls us his kids, and we're here. I don't know how old we are now. We're so small. We're kids. And there are a couple of dozen of us here today, but hundreds of them. And really probably thousands. Some of us now are teachers, doctors, professionals, lifetime YMCA people. volunteers at camp, several of us. We're parents of taking care of kids that needed extra attention. But we're all at heart Frost Valley people. And to the extent that our families and our communities and our worlds are more caring, more respectful, and more responsible, a good chunk of that has to do with our honoree, Dave King. It's in large part because of what Dave created for us, a space in which we could grow up, and then when we reach the age, usually quite young, 17 or 18, now we'd like to wait until they're 21 or 22, he turned it over to us. He got out of the way. He came in 1958, which is the first summer here at Frost Valley, as the first village chief of Lenape Village, and soon he was the program director, and then he was the director of Camp Wawayanda for many years, preceding the great D. Halby Brown, holding it together, shall I say, for anyone who remembers that period. And in 1966, Halby came, and Halby basically invited everybody to leave for reasons that it turned out were good. But he turned to Dave, whom he knew was the glue, and he asked Dave if he would stay. And they became partners and co-advisors and collaborators, and they did miracles. Soon his pressures of his job at the Baltimore County School System, a tiny little job as assistant superintendent of schools for Baltimore County, Maryland. While he was juggling that and doing full summers at Frost Valley, as the King family knows, but all of us knew Dave too, it was an awful lot of pressure, even for the big man to bear. Too much. And so he bowed out half summers and did some, whatever Halby needed him to do. That's his line, whatever you need. And he did half summers, and then after a while he retired. In one of his last summers, Halby said, I have this idea about a village of children and young adults with developmental disabilities. Do you think we could do it? Dave said, whatever you need. And he became the village chief of Seneca Village, which 10 years before its time was the forerunner of the very successful MAC program. He became a trustee of the board. And then he had to resign that because he wasn't able to get up from his job in Baltimore to come to our meetings. And then he said goodbye, and all of his kids, who'd now grown up, and we were running the place, gathered to say goodbye. It wasn't easy. Imagine a field in which you see a big man and a lot of other little people gathered around crying at basically his waist. So for a while it was very sad. A Frost Valley, a Wawayanda without Dave King, impossible. 1958 to 1977, how would we do without him? And then we realized it was a happy legacy. So many of the traditions and the practices and the customs, the little tiny things, and my camp staff pals are really going to understand this point. Hundreds of the things you people do to this day, Dave brought here and are invisibly Dave's. Every time a camp director in the dining hall ends the meal by saying, you are dismissed to chiefs, Dave's voice can be heard, Dave's legacy. But moreover, every time a child is moved by a story about honesty, respect, and responsibility at a chapel service or a morning reflection or around a campfire or during a devotion, the presence of Dave King's legacy will be felt. And every time a child comes from a chaotic home, finds peace and acceptance and happiness and fun in a consistent leadership here, which we have, thank you, Jerry. We can sense the ongoing presence of Dave King. And every time our voices join together in the magical communitarianism of singing, I hear Dave's voice echoing down this valley. At closing campfire, we always sang, and to this day, 55 years later, we still sing a song called Four Strong Winds. And the final lines of the chorus of Four Strong Winds read like a goodbye, but if you really think about them hard, they're not about goodbye at all. They're about coming back and finding your way back. For our good times are all gone, and I'm bound for moving on. I'll look for you if I'm ever back this way. It is our great fortune and honor, and for me personally and Dave's kids, a huge honor to be present when their family, when Dave and his family have come back this way as the Frost Valley YMCA Board of Trustees, with great privilege, formally induct David Guthrie King into the Frost Valley Hall of Fame. Dave, will you come up?